ladies and gentlemen. David Alexander. I am the global head of our IoT security capability for PA Consulting, based at our Technology and Innovation Centre on the edge of Cambridge. I also teach network security and crypto at Royal Holloway on their master's programme. I have a master's from Royal Holloway, and when I graduated, I'd given them such a hard time that their idea of revenge was making me stay on and teach. My focus for this part of the presentation is thinking about some of the features that Tyson talked about in his keynote, which is actually not to do with the functionality of the device itself in terms of what it's primarily designed to do. I'm thinking about the non-functional requirements. I'm also a chartered security architect, and I'm thinking about how you integrate this into the security side of your enterprise operation. So what do you need to have the device capable of doing, and how does it need to do it in order to make sure that you can actually effectively support this device, monitor it? How can you get through the NIST CSF cycle? So doing the detect, defend, react, respond, those kind of recover functionality, because they're not standalone devices. They sit in your network, they do things, they are vulnerable. So what happens when something goes wrong? And something will go wrong, whether it's by accident or design. And don't forget, in an industrial environment, 70% of what goes wrong is either a malfunction or a mistake. Yeah, it's not someone has decided to attack your system. It's not that a piece of malware's got on. It's just that something's gone wrong. And you need to be able to deal with that as much as you do with the big ticket items where somebody's hacked your systems. And Haydn will be talking, because this is a double act, about what actually happens within the device, building on the things that Chris has been talking about and things that have been mentioned elsewhere. So when I can get this to work. Why is this not? Okay, adopted apps and overcome. So why does the design of these devices matter? Thinking about the enterprise and security architecture point of view, looking at, in this case, the way that platform security architecture works, and as they would say on the BBC, other designs are available. And then finally, how do you persuade purchasing to buy what you actually need? And again, that's coming back to another point that was made earlier about how do you make sure that all the features you want are things that purchasing put into the requirements when they issue some kind of ITT. Why do I need to get this right? Why is this so important? Don't forget that IoT devices are not the same as the kind of kit you would normally find in enterprise security architecture. As someone who's done a lot of work in operational technology space in the past, I say that in order to put in a big IoT machine-to-machine network, you need to think more like a process control engineer than you do an enterprise security architect. These things work in different ways. The way you connect them to your network and the way that they handle data is very different. It's a very different mindset. And there is a great RFC. If you're ever suffering from insomnia, I thoroughly recommend it, but it's a great read. Architectural Considerations in Smart Object Networking. These things will give you large volumes of analytical data, and of course there is automated decision making that they make. You need to understand how that's going to work, because it will happen very quickly. There are microservices that will accompany the hardware that we've talked about, micro agents. And of course, some of these devices will use low power and mesh networking. That works in a very different way from anything that you've ever seen before. And there are all these different protocols. And again, we've got all these different issues to think about. How do you get different devices from different manufacturers to work together, to talk to each other, to exchange data properly? And how do you deal with the device to cloud and gateway connectivity issues? How do you secure those points? Because again, they're very different. How do you stop them beaconing out to places you don't want them to? And some of these things will do that. And also, how does IoT fit into my business model? People say, oh, I must have these things, they do a great function. Yes, that's all very well, but as a security architect, I still want to answer these classic questions. This is the top two levels of what's called the SABSA security model. It's a great security architecture. And it talks about those classic questions. What, why, how, when, where, who. Yeah? All these things that people think, oh, I'm just going to buy this piece of kit and plug it in and it'll solve my problem. That's all very well, but what about the rest of this stuff? What does it do for the business? What risks does it put in? What do I have to think about in terms of compliance? All these issues that you really need to think about at the contextual and conceptual level before you just buy a box and plug it in. As I point out, as I say to people, an IoT device is a risk in a box. How are you going to manage that risk? Yeah. And you need to think about what's your IoT network going to look like. I was head of security architecture on the UK smart metering program. So the network that links all of the electricity and gas meters to the different energy suppliers, that many-to-many enabler, I designed and built that. If the lights go out in this country, it really is my fault. That's not a joke, that's true. Trying to think about how we're going to make this work took 2 years of my life. Putting that together, working out how to do the PKI, this was not a trivial task. That's a system that will be attacked by nation states and organised crime, both of whom are very capable. You need to think about who is the threat to your network. How seriously do you need to take your security? Yep. How capable and how motivated are those threat actors? And therefore, where are you going to put your security? Where do you need to connect your devices into your network? How do you get the IoT stuff both inside your organisation and outside, if there's cloud, if there's, say, there's washing machines or delivery trucks, whatever it happens to be? How do you get that data in and out securely? This is not a trivial problem. And now I'll pass over to Haydn, who'll talk a little bit more about what happens inside the device that helps make these things possible.
Okay. Thank you, David. So I don't want to steal too much thunder from what Stefan presents later on as well, but there are obviously many standards out there for what is evolving in the chipset. So Chris talked earlier about some of the chips coming through from ST, from NXP, from Renesas and elsewhere. And in many cases, they have great security coming through. It's a little later than we'd have liked, but it's there. And one of the other requirements coming through to support this is the ARM platform security architecture. This is not to say this is the only one out there, but it is an important one. And the PSA is based around having software structures as well as hardware, leveraging what was called the TBSA-M, the Trusted Base System Architecture. So we see a number of standard components starting to come in here. We've got a bit of a issue with some reformatting on here, but up at the software level, we see the trusted boot code, which Chris was talking about earlier. There's obviously some trusted firmware. There's attestations, which may be in here. There's the TPM, and of course, random number generators for all of your asymmetric and symmetric sessions. And then at the hardware level, there is the ability to store keys, to generate keys, and to manage all of the information that we need to have down at the hardware level. So these specifications are coming through, and of course there is other specifications coming through in terms of potential legislation. So the one which most people will know here is the Code of Practice, which Amy, who's just leaving, helped drive, just to embarrass her. The DCMS, the Department for Digital Culture, Media, and of course Sport, have put out there, and the expectation really is that this is a best practice. This has now moved to a code of practice. This is going to be legislated for within the next 5 years, along similar lines to GDPR. Now, hopefully most boards are now focused on GDPR. Most people understand privacy, as we saw in the keynotes earlier. If we start seeing security at the same level, hopefully it gets on the mindset of people in the board. They start doing something about it and driving it into products. I'm working with one major consumer electronics company based out of the Netherlands. Really interesting in that the CEO of a top 50 company globally is very aware of this. His CISO is all over this. The team that the CISO run is all over this. The challenge that they have is mid-level management, the people who hold the budgets. So we are seeing some bottom up, we are seeing top down, but yet have we joined it in the middle? Well, we'll see. Obviously, some other things here. California have passed their IoT security law. This really is a first drop in the ocean. We need to see more. Obviously, the US government is looking to do some more stuff as well. I think there's a rare bipartisan act still winding its way through Congress at some level. And in the EU, ENISA is actually doing a really good job of specifying a number of components here. So I think there's 180 recommendations in their guidance. We're also seeing Asia Pacific moving forward. So in Japan, I was there a couple of weeks ago, the government have now created a working group. The only bad thing there is the cybersecurity minister has never used a computer, ever. He's always had a secretary to do it, which I think there's something to be said for having an expert in that kind of position. Obviously, Korea, South Korea, they're starting to do a lot more around cybersecurity. They've obviously got a lot of reasons to do that to the north of them. And in China, it's predominantly been led by industry, by Alibaba, as opposed to by the government, but I'm sure at some point they'll really start moving. So when we look at the evolving legislation, we have the best practice moving through to a code of practice and moving forward from there. But the guiding practices for legislation really should be that this is around reducing burden on consumers. This is not intended to be another hurdle for industry. Transparency, as we heard about earlier around privacy, how we enable people to understand what's going on. Measurability. Once we have legislation, we have to be able to measure against the legislation. Facilitation of dialogue and sharing ideas. That's generally a good thing. That's why we're in this room together. And resilience, as David was talking about, when the lights go off because the UK power system has been attacked. That's down to David and his team. So you've got to remember, I guess, that with security, there's the old kind of hackneyed term of CIA, confidentiality, integrity, availability. People remember the first, confidentiality. That's kind of crypto, of course. Integrity, people start to think about robustness and what happens when something, isn't quite right. But availability, presuming your system is going to get hacked, because we have to presume this, the question is what you do about that. How do you maintain a service? How do you identify you've been compromised? How do you recover? And how do you remediate? So, again, many people in the room will be aware of this security by design setup. Some people that may have even been involved in the creation of these. But I like this as opposed to the ENISA requirements because this talks about it in very human language, which you can take to the board, you can take to management, and really start to understand how these things are going to impact your organization. The next question, of course, is what do you do about that? And upstairs, if you have the time, we'll be actually showing some development software which we've created, which helps with some of these things called embedded trust, but I'll leave the marketing pitch at that. This is not rocket science. Those 13 requirements are largely good hygiene from my perspective. This is not trying to reinvent the wheel. This is doing basic things right. So no default password. So default passwords, we all know they're bad, but in terms of the guidance, officially, this is not acceptable and should be discontinued. That's pretty much the government putting out a pretty big stick there and going, this is wrong, we have to change this. All passwords must be unique and not resettable to a universal factory default because that enables social attacks. So if somebody can convince you to reset your device back to a known position, they can then take control of it. So it's a social attack to enable a technical attack. So we know a lot about this, and PKI really is the mechanism for doing that. Again, we have very good standard formats here. Again, the thing about the ITSF I love is we're not reinventing the wheel. We're trying to point to best practices. So whether it's X509 or an attenuated version or something similar, we can really leverage this and take it from the IT perspective and put it into the IoT domain. So we really need to be able to bring in things like the hash algorithm, private key, hash codes into a certificate which goes into our solution. And I'll step through some of this quite quickly because of time. But that can then be implemented, as Chris said, in the production machine. So these frameworks, while they're quite complex, can actually be generated on the fly in the manufacturing flow at a contract manufacturer or a programming house, and each device can be truly unique and each device can be managed securely. And of course, enabling the root of trust. So Chris again showed, the product certificate down here. Inside our chip, we have mechanisms for getting that in there. Going back to the root certificate and certificate authority. The next question for most OEMs when I've talked to them is, well, who is this? Who is the root CA? How can I manage that? Is that me as a major OEM? Is that a third party? Is it Thales? Is it DigiCert? Is it GlobalSign? Is it somebody else? And the answer is, of course, well, it depends. Depends what your organization demands. If you're a large OEM, maybe you do it yourself. Maybe you go and buy a Thales or SafeNet or somebody else's HSM. If you're a smaller organization, well, you'll probably leverage a certificate vendor itself. So we can get rid of passwords and we can start looking at ownership in a different way. The second requirement, again, is good hygiene, but is very, very rarely done, which is the vulnerability disclosure policy. As John was saying earlier, of the 500 companies they looked at online, less than 10% had a proper vulnerability disclosure framework. And that's just an embarrassment to the industry. The fact that you go to a company and there is no way of identifying there's a vulnerability and a mechanism for them to respond, is a failure of the electronics industry, of the consumer electronics industry. Again, in best practice, you should always have a nominated C-suite person, whether it's the CISO or whether it's the COO, who owns responsibility for the security within their own products. The CISO has to switch from just looking after IT to looking after the products that they ship. But we don't see that enough. And of course, we have to keep our software updated. The third one, this is going back to the keynote earlier. This really is a fundamental, and yet most people ship without really thinking about how they're going to manage that update. Because it is complex. There's complex ownership systems in here. So once I've shipped a product, it may be integrated by a third party. It may go into a larger product. It may end up at an end user. And how do you push out the updates for that? How do you get through that ownership? Well, it is complex, and there are lots of stakeholders in there. But in the first case, just actually being able to identify a device, a group of devices, or all of my devices for updates with versioning, with anti-rollback capabilities, are really important foundations. So we need to have confidentiality, we need to have trust, we need to have non-repudiation, especially anything around a financial or high-value transaction there. So, and I think we talked about the root of trust earlier. and Chris again touched on the requirement for the secure boot manager, which is really a fundamental. Now, again, there are a number of ways of getting the SBM. It may be something which is unique to your company. Fantastic, you've built your own, that's great. It may be that you want to use something like the Trusted Firmware Initiative. That's great too. Or maybe you use one, for example, in the tools that we've got upstairs, which again include things like all of the secure key management, foundation boots, update frameworks, version management, all the way up to modular updates. Okay. So, I think back to you.
Thank you. Yes.
Thanks, David.
This comes back to the point I was making about being able to do more than just get your devices to work. How do you manage and monitor your IoT estate once you've built it? How do you then proceed to monitor it, to do things like those updates? And one challenge that we looked at last year was from a global car manufacturer. As we move towards autonomous vehicles, how do I deploy software, firmware updates to 5 million cars that are spread across almost every country on the planet? How do I do that in such a way that it happens automatically and safely, and yet in a way that doesn't affect the safety of the car, but at the same time doesn't leave me liable for an accident because a car hasn't received the update? That becomes a very interesting challenge. How do you integrate the IoT into your protective monitoring system? So you've got a security operating center, whether it's in-house or external. How do I make that work? How do I actually use the information from these devices? Can I get information from these devices that I can feed into the SOC? And how do I integrate that? How do I parse that into my CM tools to get meaningful data out of it? Can I? Is this something that the device manufacturers have thought about? So what non-functional requirements does the IoT infrastructure need to make that possible? How do I collect data, meaningful data, and get it in real time through to my system? Stuff that's useful to me if I'm trying to detect there's been a problem or diagnose that problem. Do I need to acquire new technology? What skills am I going to need to give my SOC personnel to make that possible? How much do they need to know about the IoT devices? What am I going to have to do to update my incident, my BCP, and my DR plans? And how am I going to develop and execute exercises that include IoT and reinforce that training? You may think, well, actually, do I need to do that? Well, I've just done 6 weeks of work for an organisation that operates in a really, really safety-critical environment. They do uranium enrichment. They have drills every single week that talks about IoT. Most of their people are either ex-US Navy submarine or aircraft carrier nuclear power personnel. These guys know safety inside out and backwards. They still train on this every single week. For them, it's absolutely critical. It may not be quite so important for your organisation, but you still need to have the skills to do it. And how do I demonstrate compliance? If I've got regulators, if I've got people saying, well, actually, yes, you've got to be, you need to show that this stuff is safety critical or important. How do I show that my environment that I've built is compliant with the appropriate piece of legal and regulatory requirements? How do I make sure that if I've got cyber insurance, that I meet the terms and conditions in it? If there's some kind of incident, are they going to find something in the small print that allows them to weasel out of paying me? What are the ITSF best practice guidelines? What about the DHS guidelines or the DCMS principles? How do I decide which standard I'm going to choose? These are all difficult questions that you need to think about. Do I need independent third-party assessment? I know that working group is still in progress and coming up with some answers. That's something that part of our organisation are looking at as well. And what are useful and qualitative metrics? What data can I actually take that helps me? Are there quantitative metrics that I can get out of this? Now, of course, historical data is always going to be difficult when you talk about new technology, but you've got to start somewhere. And then that brings me back to the point I talked about, we mentioned about purchasing. How do I specify what the criteria are for my device? Not just for the function I want it to do, but for all those other issues that I've talked about and that Haydn's mentioned. How do I make sure that we've got the appropriate things like key management and storage. What do I have, if anything, in the way of a secure enclave where I do development of code? How do I work with third parties? Do I need to worry about cryptographic accelerator performance? This may not sound important, but if you're starting to produce devices and personalize them en masse, the time it takes to build up the entropy required for a proper random function, you can't just go churning out key after key after key. You actually have to allow time before you generate the next key pair so that there isn't predictability from one to the other. We're now talking about the scary kind of mathematics I studied under Fred Piper at Royal Holloway, but it is important. For example, the UK smart metering program, we spent tens of millions on our cryptographic capability, and we could only generate securely 350,000 key pairs a day. That's important. How do I produce scoring guidelines, a balanced scorecard that takes all the appropriate criteria into account when I'm producing, when I talk to purchasing? And how do I define what I need in the way of support and monitoring and cryptographic functions? How do I justify the spend or the criteria? And what am I going to define in the way of network protocols and how ISI layers 1 and 2 work to make sure that it's interoperable with any other technology that I've already got? So I don't have those problems of trying to get two totally different devices using different protocols and radio frequencies to try and communicate. It's always going to be a problem. Which brings us through to the summary. How do we define the right criteria? It's always going to be a challenge. There's a lot more to consider than just what's in the microcontroller and what it does. Not all devices are equal. Not all secure enclaves will manage security to the same kind of level. Are you ready for new legislation? We mentioned the California SB 327. Don't forget that California is, by many standards, the 5th largest economy in the world. No manufacturer in his right mind is going to ignore a market that size, and therefore they're probably going to start producing devices that meet the California legislation. And they're not going to produce devices that fit different markets around the world. They're probably going to produce the same device, the same kind of code. Therefore, I suspect that California legislation will actually play a larger part in the way that IoT devices are secured than anybody thinks right now. And of course, how do I measure the security performance? There's an old classic, you can't manage what you can't measure. The same will apply to IoT security. You've gone out and specified and said, we need to do this, this, and this. How do you justify afterwards that it was worthwhile? Management are going to want to know, otherwise they won't let you spend that money again. Okay. Anything you want to add to that?
No, I think we're out of time thoroughly, so
okay.
Thank you very much, David.